Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are continuing to walk through the creation account, which may seem odd on the surface because, well, we wrapped up the seventh day of creation the last time when God rested. But today we are going to go actually to Genesis chapter 2, and we're going to go back to the creation of mankind. But we're really going to zoom in on the creation of mankind specifically. And we're going to ask one big question today. Is Genesis chapter 1 a separate creation account from Genesis chapter 2? Or is it that Genesis chapter 1 is just a broad view of the creation of everything, whereas Genesis chapter 2 is a zoom in to the creation of mankind specifically? I definitely believe in that latter case there. So we'll take a look at why I think that is the case as we go through the context of Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 through 17, which is where we are going to be today. And then we're going to wrap up the creation account next week. So today, though, we are going to zoom in on the creation of mankind. So let's start in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 2. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land, and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All right, let's pause there. There's a lot going on. All right, so right off the bat, you have this basically just this kind of summary statement in verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So at the first look, you may think, well, maybe that theory about Genesis 1 and 2 being separate accounts or separate creations as a whole, maybe there's some validity to it because it's almost like, we're done with chapter 1, that time is past, and now we're on to Genesis chapter 2. I don't see it here based on the context of chapter 2. First off, the writing of chapters 1 and 2 are very, very interesting. In chapter 1, it's still a narrative, but it's just has a almost kind of a iambic or poetry feel to it. It's still narrative and it's still historical, but it has this very just pattern filled writing style that we talked about. And God said, and then whatever he created, and it was so, and then and it was morning and it was evening the whatever day. So that pattern we saw throughout chapter 1. And then chapter 2, especially in verses 5 through 9, which we just read, that pattern is gone. There's still a historical narrative to it, but there's not this pattern and the style that you see in chapter 1. Now, some would say that that's because chapter 1 is a different creation account. The problem with that is that you don't see any other form of creation outside of the garden and humankind or Adam and Eve in chapter 2. Yes, you get mentions of, hey, be, you know, steward everything that I have created. But the actual creating of the earth and the cosmos and birds and sea living creatures and the land living creatures, that's not described in the same way as chapter 1. So for me, I would go, we're really just zooming in to the creation of mankind specifically because of how chapter 2 is written. It is this, okay, everything is made, but there is something that is made that is beautifully done and is more unique than the other parts of creation. Doesn't mean that God doesn't care about plants and animals and the stars and the sun and the moon. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we as human beings are uniquely made because we're made in the image of God, as we saw in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And so here in chapter 2, I think that idea of us being uniquely made is put front and center with how it is written. There's no patterns to it. It is just this beautiful historical narrative that is put on the page. Now, one thing that I do think that's also really, really cool here is the word generation. So, the original Hebrew word for this word generations, yes, can mean generations, but it can also mean the word genealogy, which, if you know me, you would probably know that I love genealogies, but it's this idea of birth and setting up a record. And so when the account reads here in verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens, the earth when they were created. You could also read these are the genealogies. These are the birth of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So that word, that original word there, is really beautifully done and really beautifully selected for the description of the creation account in chapter 1. It's not just this random happening that happened. No, it is a beautifully masterful work on God's part to set the foundation for life itself. And just what a beautifully way to put that. I don't know much else to say. But what a beautiful way to put that. Now, the word day is interesting. So it does say day here, and it is singular, the original Hebrew word. But as we remembered, as we went back to chapter 1, when we were talking about the word day, that word day, that Hebrew word for day, if you remember yom, yom, that word, yes, it can mean 24-hour day, which I think it definitely does in chapter 1, but it can also mean a period of time. And I think this is kind of what we're talking about here in chapter 2, because as we see with chapter 1, you have the setting of and there was evening and there was morning that day, that pattern that we talked about, that here is not seen. So I think for me, that word day, yom, is meant for a specific amount of time, which I do believe is 6 days, based on Genesis chapter 1 and the context that it uses the word yom in, whereas here the context is this summary of everything in chapter 1, and so it would stand for a certain amount of days, which again I believe is 6 based on chapter 1. So I just wanted to clear up why that is saying day instead of days. Just want to put that out there. Now, when it comes to verses 5 through 9, just some really, really cool things are happening here. First off, I do want to, again, kind of squash a little bit of a theory here. There's this theory that there's a contradiction here in verse 5 with chapter 1. So in chapter 1, when were the plants made? They were made on which day? Third day. So they were made on the third day, whereas humankind was made on the sixth day. The problem is, though, if we're zooming into the creation of mankind, so we're looking at a zoomed in version of day 6, the problem is there's no bush of the field and yet was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up. That word for land can also mean earth, by the way. But yet the plants were created on day 3. So how is that? Is that a contradiction? On the surface, it sure maybe seems like it. Until we look at a very specific phrase that happens not just once, but twice here in verse 5. So, see here, it's not just a bush or it's not just a small plant in verse 5, but it's a bush of the field or a small plant of the field. And I think that phrase, of the field, breaks the contradiction theory. The of the field actually is referencing to a spot of land that would be worked on by farmers or people in agriculture specifically. Basically, these plants, these small plants and these bushes of the field, were plants that were specifically going to be created when the work of gardening began. And of course, without human beings on the earth, God is holding back those plants, the bush of the field and the small plant of the field, until mankind is created to give him the mission of being the steward of God's creation. How cool is that, right? The fact that God kept kept some of the plants behind, the creation of some of the plants behind, so that we could be put on a mission when we were created as humanity. Really cool to see. Again, on the surface, I get why people see this as a contradiction, but when you actually look at the phrasing, look at the way that the phrase was written in the context that's written in, the bush of the field and the small plant of the field, it's not a contradiction at all. Instead, it's this beautiful reminder that God has put us on mission, which we kind of talked about with Genesis chapter 1. But just really, really cool to see, and so I wanted to bring that up to you before we got too much into it. The talk about the no rain, I think that really is definitely kind of giving you a look at why there was so much rain and why there was the global flood with the time of Noah in Genesis chapters 6 and 7. I think that's really interesting to look at, but I don't have time right now, so I can't look at that today. But then you have verse 7, and it's just, what a great picture is painted here. So you have the idea that God created us in the image of God from Genesis chapter 1. So we already know that, but now we're zooming into what that looked like, and it is so cool. So God takes dust from the ground, breathes, and forms. So he forms from the dust of the ground us as humanity. He forms Adam out of the dust of the ground and then breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Whoa, how cool is that? And I think when he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, it's also this idea of not just God as creator, but God as sustainer. I mean, it's just this remarkable idea that every single time that you and I take a breath, that is coming from God. That whole process of oxygen coming in and then carbon dioxide leaving as we exhale, and how we can do that with our lungs and everything involved with the respiratory system is incredible to think about. I mean, and it all comes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, because the idea that we are formed by God, made in his image from Genesis chapter 1, and then breathed into us the breath of life in Genesis 2, 7. Whoa, how just remarkable is our God. And at the same time, it still shows us as well that we are a uniquely created being from the rest of creation. So I just, could not could not stop to just be in marvel of that for a second. And then you have in verses 8 and 9 just this setting up of the creation of the Garden of Eden. But then you also have the setting up of the two trees that will take really center stage with chapter 3 of Genesis with the fall. And that's the tree of life, and then the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which, again, those are for a different time, so I can't talk about those today. But it is cool, though, to see that even though mankind had not been created before the creation of the bush of the field and the small plant of the field, it is cool to see that as God is creating mankind, he is also creating a garden as well to put them in. And so the first plants that could then be worked on, God creates those too. It's not like human beings get the credit for the bush of the field and the small plant of the field. God still creates those as well because he is the one who created the Garden of Eden, as we see in verse 8. And then as well in verse 9 too, the talking about the creating of every tree that's pleasant to the sight and good for food. Verses 10 through 14, I'm not going to go reading into those just because it is just really just showing where the Garden of Eden was. These names and places, some of them have gone, and we're just not entirely sure where we can pinpoint the Garden of Eden or where it could have been. Some believe that they can. That is not a point of this video at all. That would be cool to look at. That's not the point of this video. But verses 10 through 14 is just to show how the Garden of Eden was masterfully placed by God in a place that had plenty of water and therefore a source of life, not just once, but 4 rivers. And it's cool, too, to think that those rivers are coming from the Garden of Eden. Verse 10, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. Really, really cool to see that. Again, if that's for a different day, so we won't go into all 4 of those. But then let's go with verses 15 through 17 here, and then we will wrap up. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. All right, so just like with Genesis chapter 1, we are given the command by God to be a steward of his creation. Now here it is really cool because it is a very specific part of creation, which is the Garden of Eden that God has placed humanity in. But is it just the Garden of Eden that he's supposed to steward? No, it is every part of creation that he is supposed to steward, going back to Genesis chapter 1. But it is really cool to see that same command follow suit into chapter 2. And then, of course, you get the command to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which sadly Adam and Eve do in Genesis chapter 3. And speaking of Eve, yes, we are going to get to Eve, and we are going to get to that, though, next week. So today, I hope you just enjoyed as we looked at this idea that there might be 2 creation accounts between 1 and 2, even though I don't think there is, based on, I don't believe there is, based on the context of Genesis chapter 2 and what we saw today within it. But also thank you for just taking a look at the creation of man again once more. But we will continue to look at the creation of mankind as we see the creation of Eve next week. And so I will see you then. Thanks.